Settle in and let go. There's nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to hold on to. While the world sleeps, we'll drift softly into the old quiet legend surrounding a cursed painting. If nights like this help, subscribe. There's a fresh one every evening. The brush is a fine one, a single hair's width at its tip, loaded with a small quantity of paint, mixed to a consistency just slightly thinner than cream, white with the faintest trace of gray added to it, enough to suggest translucence, enough to hold light. The artist draws it downward, along the surface of the canvas, with the particular patience of a person who has done this many times, and knows that this part cannot be hurried. A tear track forms. It catches the light of the studio, the way a real tear would catch it, not brightly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, subdued gleam of something wet against warm skin. The studio is quiet. Outside, somewhere in Venice, or in one of the smaller towns of the Veneto, the ordinary sounds of a mid-century Italian afternoon are going about their business. Inside, the painter works. The child's face on the canvas already carries everything that will make this image persist for decades. The lowered gaze, the reddened eyelid, the open mouth drawn not into a cry, but into the silent, held expression of someone who has been crying and has not quite stopped. The dark background comes almost to the edges of the child's face, pressing inward around it, making the pale skin and the wet eyes the only place the eye wants to rest. The painter adds the final tear track and sets the brush down. The painting is, in the practical sense of the word, complete. The man who made it was named Bruno Amadio. He was Venetian by birth, trained in the figurative tradition, and by the mid-20th century, working as a painter with the commercial instincts of a person who understood that talent and visibility are not the same thing. The European and British print trade of the post-war years was a particular kind of market, large, practical, governed by what would sell in volume, and not especially interested in the biographical details of the people who made the images it reproduced and distributed. For this market, Amadio adopted a working name. He called himself Giovanni Bragolin, a name without strong national or regional associations, a name that sat easily in a catalog, that a buyer in Birmingham or Bradford would not stumble over, that sounded neither too foreign nor too familiar. Giovanni Bragolin. The name appeared on lithographic prints sold across Britain for years, before most people who owned one would have had occasion to notice it at all. It appeared in small type, at the lower edge of the image, where the painter's signature traditionally sits, and where, in a mass-market print hung at eye level in a domestic hallway, it would typically be read once, when the picture was first unwrapped, and then never looked at again. The name was a practical instrument. It served its purpose, and then receded, the way a well-designed frame recedes, giving the image room to be itself. What Amadio produced under this name was not a single painting. That is the first thing worth knowing about the crying boy, and one of the things that gets quietly set aside in most tellings of its story. The image that would come to be known by that name, and to carry, later, its particular reputation, was one of at least 65 distinct variations that Amadio's studio produced across different child subjects, different compositions, different arrangements of that characteristic dark background, and those tilted, glistening eyes. Some of the children were boys. Some were girls. Some were older, some younger. Some wept with their faces turned 3/4 toward the viewer, some almost full front. The child who would become most widely reproduced in Britain was a dark-haired boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, his expression carrying that specific quality of suspended grief, grief that has passed its loudest moment and settled into something quieter and more patient. The series, taken as a whole, represents a substantial body of commercial figurative work. 65 variations require sustained effort. It requires a painter working with consistent attention to a formula that clearly had market appeal, refining it across multiple versions in the way that any skilled commercial artist refines a successful approach. The emotional territory was consistent. Childhood distress, rendered with technical care, in a style that was sentimental without being saccharine, emotionally immediate without being agitated. Whatever one makes of the aesthetic, the craft is evident. The tear tracks in every version are painted with the same quiet technical precision as the one described here at the start, that careful, slow downward pull of the loaded brush along the painted cheek, the painter's patience visible in every example. The original paintings produced in the late 1940s and into the early 1950s were the kind of work that feeds the commercial print trade without necessarily attracting gallery attention. A figurative painter of Amadio's competence in the mid-20th century occupied a particular professional position, skilled enough to produce images of genuine technical quality, working in a mode too traditional and too emotionally direct for the critical vocabulary of contemporary art, but perfectly calibrated for the mass reproduction market that was, at the same moment in post-war European history, expanding rapidly. People were rebuilding, people were buying things for their homes, people were acquiring, for the first time in many cases, the small domestic objects, the framed prints, the decorative ceramics, the patterned curtain fabric that gave a home the feeling of being deliberately arranged rather than merely inhabited. The lithographic reproduction process that carried Amadio's Weeping Children into this expanding market was, in the 1950s, a mature and highly efficient technology. A lithographic press could produce hundreds of faithful reproductions from a single prepared stone or plate in a working day. The original painting was translated into the press through a photomechanical process, the image captured, separated into its tonal components, and transferred to the printing surface with a precision that had been refined over more than a century of commercial print production. When a sheet of paper passed through the rollers and emerged at the end of the press, it carried a reproduction that at normal viewing distance was convincingly faithful to the original. Not a copy in the handmade sense, but something built from the same visual information, carrying the same tonal relationships, presenting the same face. A commercial print house in the early 1950s, running a batch of Bragolin reproductions, would have processed them with the same unhurried efficiency as any other job in the queue. The press operator would have checked the registration, the alignment of the ink on the paper, and watched the sheets move through with the practiced ease of a person for whom this particular kind of image holds no more or less interest than any other. A stack of weeping boys, freshly printed, waiting to dry, another stack behind them, and another behind that. The press moving steadily, indifferent to what it was making, producing something that would find its way into tens of thousands of British homes before anyone had occasion to think carefully about what it meant that so many people wanted to hang a crying child on their wall. By the time these prints reached Britain in quantity, the post-war economic recovery was beginning to produce something new in British domestic life, disposable income in working-class households that had previously had very little of it. The 1950s and into the 1960s saw a gradual expansion of the consumer market into social spaces that had not previously participated in it to any significant degree. Mail-order catalogs expanded their reach, chain stores multiplied, market stalls, the informal, flexible, cash-in-hand retail environment that occupied the spaces between the major shops and the department stores, proliferated in the town centers and covered markets of northern and Midlands England, and they carried everything from bedding to crockery to framed prints. The Crying Boy, in its various sizes and frames, was available through all of these channels. Woolworths stocked prints. Market stalls in towns across Yorkshire, Lancashire, and the Midlands displayed rows of them, leaned against trestle tables, or hung from temporary frames, priced in chalk on hand-lettered cards. A small print could be had for a few shillings, a larger one, already framed, for £1 or £2. At those prices, the decision to buy one was not a significant financial event for most households. It was the kind of quiet, ordinary purchase that happens on a Saturday afternoon when something catches the eye. When a person stops at a stall and looks at a row of framed prints and finds that one of them seems, in some way, right for the hallway, the right size, the right feeling, something that would go well above the sideboard. Consider a market stall in a Yorkshire town in 1968. It is a covered market, probably, the kind with a glass roof and iron columns, the stalls arranged in rows under the steel and glass roof that keeps the weather off the sellers and their goods without keeping the cold out. The print stall has a good position, close to one of the main pedestrian routes through the market. The prints are displayed in 2 or 3 rows, landscapes at the back, a few portraits near the front, and along one side a run of Bragolin reproductions at slightly different sizes, all showing the same face. The small ones are in thin wood frames. The largest one has been given a slightly more elaborate border, a wider mat, a frame with a modest decorative edge. The difference between the cheapest and the most expensive in the row is perhaps 18 shillings. A woman stops, looks at them, picks up the middle-sized one. She holds it at arm's length, the way you hold a picture when you are trying to imagine it on a wall, tilting it slightly to see how the glass catches the light. She has a particular space in mind. The hallway of a terraced house, the kind with a narrow entrance passage and a staircase immediately inside the front door. The wall to the left bare, except for a small mirror and a hook for coats. The print would go there, above the mirror. The face would be visible from the front door as you came in, and from the top of the stairs as you came down in the morning. She buys it. The stall holder wraps it in a square of brown paper and folds the edges down, and she carries it home on the bus with it resting on her knees, the weeping boy's face enclosed in its brown paper package, unremarkable among the other shopping bags and parcels on the bus. This was not an unusual event. Some version of this scene was occurring at regular intervals across Britain throughout the late 1950s, the 1960s, and into the 1970s. The prints moved through market stalls and Woolworths and the catalog pages of great Universal and Freeman's and Empire stores. They moved through discount furniture shops and hardware stores that had added a small print display near the till. They appeared in the window displays of frame shops in high streets that had not yet been pedestrianized. They appeared, ordered by post, in cardboard tubes or flat-packed parcels sent to addresses in rural areas where the nearest market town was 20 miles away. A print publisher's order ledger from the early 1970s would have recorded them in the same flat commercial language used for every other line: 48 units, mixed sizes, Bragolin Weeping Boy, dispatched to a discount furniture wholesaler in the English Midlands, with a notation of the total units shipped and the expected delivery date. One line among many in a ledger that contained hundreds of similar lines. The cumulative effect of all these individual transactions, occurring over roughly 2 decades, was something that could only become visible in retrospect. By the late 1970s, the Bragolin prints and the Weeping Boy image in particular, had achieved a density of distribution in British working-class domestic interiors that made them, in certain parts of the country, almost a default feature of the home, not in every home, not inevitable, but common enough to be unremarkable, which is a different kind of presence from common. Unremarkable is the right word. The prints hung in living rooms and hallways, and in some cases bedrooms, with the specific unremarkability of things that have been in a house long enough to stop being noticed as objects, the way a particular kind of patterned wallpaper stops being noticed, the way a set of decorative china on a shelf stops being seen as individual objects and becomes simply part of the visual background of a room. The crying boy's face, glistening in its frame, was visible at a glance from certain positions in a great many British living rooms, and the people in those rooms had long since stopped seeing it in any active sense. It was there. It had always been there. It would presumably always be there. These are the terms on which ordinary domestic objects live their lives. It is worth holding this fact quietly for a moment. The painting that would come to carry a particular reputation was, before any reputation attached to it, simply a widely owned household object. It was in the category of things that nearly everyone had some version of, not a luxury, not a statement, not a carefully chosen piece of art, but one of the practical, affordable, pleasant enough decorative objects that furnished the walls of homes that had not previously had much to put on their walls. The Weeping Boy shared the category with the landscape watercolor print, and the botanical study, and the framed reproduction of a Dutch interior, and the abstract pattern in warm earth tones. These were all objects that served the same function, filling the wall in a way that felt finished, that suggested the room was arranged rather than abandoned. What distinguished the Weeping Boy from the botanical print, if anything distinguished it at all, to the people who owned both, was perhaps only the quality of the image's emotional directness. A child crying is, in purely perceptual terms, a stimulus that the human face-reading apparatus treats with some seriousness. The composition, as Amadio designed it, gives nothing to look at except the face. The dark background eliminates all competing detail, and the downward gaze and parted lips draw the eye toward the expressive center of the image, with a simplicity that is almost diagrammatic in its efficiency. To hang the print in a room was to place a small, precise emotional signal on the wall, a signal that said grief, specifically and without ambiguity. Whether the people who owned these prints thought about this is not recorded. Most consumer decisions about decorative objects are made on the basis of aesthetic pleasure and price rather than extended reflection on what the image depicts. The child was well painted. The image was affecting in the way that well-painted images of children typically are. It cost little. It looked right on the wall. These were sufficient reasons, and they were, by the late 1970s, reasons that had been sufficient for enough people that the prints had become part of the domestic texture of a significant portion of the British population. Among the things that no one was thinking about, in those households, was the name of the person who had made the original painting. Giovanni Bragolin was a name that appeared in small type at the bottom of the print and nowhere else. The painter behind it, Bruno Amadio, Venetian, trained in the figurative tradition, had produced his Weeping Children series and sent it into the reproduction market and moved on to other work. The prints lived their lives in their frames on their walls, independent of their origin, in the way that all successfully distributed commercial images eventually become independent of their origins. The image outlives the biography of the person who made it. The face on the wall has nothing to say about the studio in which it was first rendered. The brush loaded with thinned white paint, the slow downward stroke along the painted cheek. The lithographic process that had reproduced Amadio's paintings across those 2 decades was a process of mechanical faithfulness, a careful, impersonal transcription of one set of visual information into another medium. What the press reproduced was the image, not the act of making it, not the hand that drew the tear track, not the particular quality of attention the painter brought to that specific formal problem of representing something as difficult to paint convincingly as the surface of a tear on skin. The prints contained all of this in the sense that the original contained it, because the reproduction was faithful, but the process that made them was indifferent to it. There is something gently interesting in that gap between the specificity of what was made and the impersonality of how it was made available. Amadio chose his colors and his composition and the exact angle of the child's head with the considered attention of a trained figurative painter working on a problem he had thought about across many versions. The press that reproduced his work thousands of times in an afternoon was operating on a principle of exact repetition, not interpretation. And the Saturday morning buyer at the Yorkshire market stall was looking at the result of both of these processes and seeing only a picture, a face, a tear, a price. The prints were, in this sense, ordinary objects with an unusual density of human intention buried inside them, the painter's technical care, the commercial publisher's calculation about what would sell, the press operator's professional attention to registration and ink weight, the market stall holder's judgment about display and pricing, the buyer's aesthetic response and domestic pragmatism. All of this present in the object, none of it visible to the person who hung it on the wall and went back to watching television. By the mid-1970s, certain publishers were logging another batch of Bragelin reproductions, mixed sizes, the standard assortment, against distribution orders that would carry them into shops and stalls for the following season. The image had been in continuous production for roughly 2 decades at this point. The plates were not new, the composition was not new. The weeping child had been reproduced so many times that the technical documents relating to the print job would have been entirely routine, just another run of a reliable seller, noted in the ledger with the same flat precision as a reorder of decorative plates or a new shipment of flower prints. It is not difficult to imagine the cumulative geography of those orders if one were to plot them, the distribution lines running outward from the print houses to the wholesalers to the individual shops and stalls, branching through the industrial towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire, through the Midlands, into Wales and Scotland, into the coastal towns and the market towns and the suburban high streets, each branch ending at a point of sale, and from each point of sale radiating outward into homes, one print at a time, until the weeping boy's face was present on the walls of some number of British homes, that it would be essentially impossible to calculate precisely, but entirely reasonable to estimate in the hundreds of thousands of rooms, each one containing a wall, and on that wall a frame, and inside that frame a child's face, with a tear track painted with a fine brush by a man in a studio in mid-century Italy who had found, across 65 variations, a Tatakurni way of painting grief that the reproduction market had found sufficient reason to carry across 2 decades of continuous distribution. The prints varied slightly between versions and between print runs, slightly different color saturation, slightly different cropping, slight variations in the size and weight of the frame that might have been supplied by the printer, or added by the retailer, or chosen by the buyer from options at the stall. But the face was constant. The tear track was constant. The dark background pressing in around the pale skin was constant. the slightly parted mouth and the lowered eyes, and the expression that existed in the specific emotional register between active crying and recovering from it were constant, reproduced faithfully enough across 2 decades of lithographic repetition that the image retained its legibility, its emotional directness, its specific quality of quiet, suspended grief. There was, across the decades of the print's quiet domestic life, no particular reason to look at it carefully. It did what it was supposed to do. It filled the wall. It was a recognized image, seen often enough to have lost the slight novelty that any new picture brings when it first arrives on a wall. It had settled into the background of the rooms it inhabited with the easy permanence of things that belong there, not because they were always there, but because enough time has passed that there is no longer any memory of the wall without them. A framed crying boy print hanging in an ordinary British living room in the late 1970s would have been exactly this kind of settled, unremarkable background presence. The glass face catching the light from the window in the early afternoon, the child's eyes lowered, the tear track catching the light from the window at a certain angle and briefly showing the careful painted gloss of that final transparent stroke. The dark background of the painting making the frame around it almost invisible by contrast, the whole thing sitting on the wall with the quiet authority of something that has been in place long enough to stop being questioned. How many such rooms there were across Britain is not a number that any ledger or distribution record captures in full. The individual transactions that placed those prints on those walls were too small and too various and too spread across too many years and too many different retail channels to be gathered into a single precise figure. The orders that can be traced, the distribution records that survive, the retail histories that can be reconstructed from old catalogs and trade records, these give a partial account. They suggest scale. They suggest density. They give a sense of the image as something that moved through the consumer market with the quiet persistence of a successful product, finding its way into rooms through 100 different routes, settling onto walls, and staying there. Somewhere in that uncountable range of rooms, in a terraced house in a northern town, in a semi-detached suburb in the Midlands, in a council flat in Glasgow or Cardiff or Birmingham, the print hung, and the child's face looked downward at the room, and the tear track caught the afternoon light from the window, and no one in the room was thinking about any of it. The picture was there. The room was a room. The afternoon was an afternoon. The specific and traceable human history of the object on the wall, the Venetian painter, the pseudonym, the lithographic press, the market stall, the wrapping in brown paper, the Saturday bus home, was as invisible as it almost always is, buried inside an ordinary thing, present in every line of it, and noticed by no one at all. On a concrete doorstep somewhere in Britain, on the morning of the 4th of September, 1985, a newspaper lay face up in the early light. The dew had just begun to settle at the edges of the newsprint, softening the corners of the paper where it rested against the step. The headline was large and in bold type, the kind of type that occupied the full width of the front page without apology, the kind that was meant to be read from across a room rather than up close. It said, "Blazing Curse of the Crying Boy." Below it, reproduced in newsprint gray, was the face that tens of thousands of British households already knew. A child's face, eyes brimming, cheeks wet, the dark background of the painting pressed close behind the figure as always, the expression caught in that particular moment, just before the tears fall in earnest. The print was sitting on someone's doorstep, as it sat on millions of doorsteps that morning. The paper was still cool from the night air. The headline was perfectly visible. That particular morning began a story that, in its way, never entirely ended. The Sun on that September day had published what it described as a consistent and unexplained pattern across multiple house fires in Yorkshire. The foundational claim was specific: firefighters attending the scenes of otherwise severe and destructive domestic fires had, on repeated occasions, found framed prints of the crying boy painting intact among the ruins. The fires had consumed furniture, flooring, structural timbers, personal belongings, and the contents of rooms entirely. The prints had survived. This was, according to the story, not a single incident, but a recurring one. The paper presented it not as a ghost story, not as speculation, but as a report of what firefighters had observed and discussed among themselves. The framing was investigative, the tone insistent. Something was happening in Yorkshire, the paper said, and no one had explained it. The specific incidents described in the original article centered on South Yorkshire and on the town of Rotherham in particular. One described case had a framed print found face down on the floor of a room that had been gutted by fire, the floor scorched, the walls stripped, the room's contents reduced to debris, and the print lying among it with its glass face against the blackened boards, its image unscorched, and the glass unbroken. It was the kind of detail that is easy to hold in the mind because it is so precisely imagined. That particular image of the print lying flat in the ruins of the room, almost resting, the weeping face sealed against the floor. It was that image, as much as any argument the article made, that caught and held the attention of the people who read it. Among the people named in the original story was a firefighter from the South Yorkshire Fire Brigade named Mick Riley. He was quoted directly, and what he said was careful rather than dramatic, the kind of statement a person makes when they have genuinely noticed something they cannot immediately account for. He and colleagues had attended multiple fire scenes. They had seen the prints surviving. They had talked among themselves about what they were observing. What Riley's testimony contributed to the story was a quality of professional witness. These were not frightened homeowners attributing bad luck to a painting they had disliked anyway, but people whose job involved examining the physical aftermath of fires with systematic attention and who were reporting what they had seen in that professional context. The story was built partly on that distinction. The paper understood that a firefighter noticing something carried a different weight than a reader writing in to say they had always found the painting unsettling. Whether the pattern that Riley and his colleagues had observed could bear the interpretive weight the story placed on it was a different question, and one the original article did not linger over. The reader response was very large. Within the first 2 weeks of publication, the Sun reported receiving thousands of letters about the story, making it one of the highest response features the paper had run. The letters came from across Britain and described, with varying degrees of specificity, encounters with the painting that their writers felt the original story had explained, or at least given language to. Some letters described fires, some described accidents, some described sequences of domestic misfortune that had followed, their writers now said, from the arrival of a print in the household. Some were from people who had given the print away, or thrown it out, or found one in a house they had moved into, or been given one as a gift by someone who had not known about the story. The sheer number of letters, whatever their individual content, changed the nature of the story. It was no longer a report about Yorkshire firefighters. It had become something larger, a conversation that was taking place simultaneously in thousands of households about an object that had been hanging on their walls, often for years, without particular remark. The follow-up articles ran through September and into October of that year. Each one extended the geography of the reported incidents, gathered new testimony, and reproduced new versions of the weeping face to illustrate the coverage. The story had the structure that sustains itself. It required nothing more than continued reader participation to continue, and reader participation was arriving at the paper in sacks. The geography of reported incidents, as it spread across the paper's follow-up coverage, stretched considerably beyond Yorkshire. Letters described incidents in Birmingham, in Glasgow, in Bristol, in Belfast. There were accounts from rural Wales, from East Anglia, from towns the paper's informal tallying could not always immediately place. What the spread of locations did, as it accumulated across the follow-up issues, was transform the story from a regional curiosity into something that appeared to map onto the entire distribution network of the prints themselves. The Crying Boy had been sold through chain stores and market stalls across Britain for decades. The reports, as they arrived, seemed to follow exactly the same national footprint. One way to hold that pattern is as evidence of something present in the painting itself, something that traveled with each reproduction wherever it went. Another way to hold it is simply as evidence of how widely the prints had been sold, and how many households contained one, and how many of those households had experienced a fire or a misfortune at some point in the years or decades since. These two ways of holding the pattern do not look quite the same when they are described directly. They look quite different, in fact. The paper in those weeks generally held to the first way, and its readers, in their thousands of letters, largely wrote from within the same frame. None of the incidents described in the reader letters were documented through official fire brigade reports that independent journalists could access and verify. This is not to say the fires did not happen. Domestic fires are common, and the number of households containing Crying Boy prints was very large by 1985. It is simply to record what kind of evidence the story rested on. The foundation was testimony, what readers wrote to a newspaper to describe, what a firefighter stated in an interview, what editors reported receiving in their postal bag. Testimony is a genuine form of evidence. It is also a form of evidence that is shaped by the questions people are asked, the frame they are operating within when they write, and the things they notice and record versus the things they do not. The Sun's coverage gave its readers a specific frame, a specific pattern to notice, and a specific set of questions. The letters that came back were answers to those questions, written from inside that frame. There is something worth attending to in how quickly the frame spread. On the morning of the 3rd of September, a person in Glasgow who owned a Crying Boy print had not, in all likelihood, thought about it recently. It was a print on a wall. It had been there for some years. It was the kind of object that becomes part of a room's background, unremarkable, habitual, the visual equivalent of a piece of furniture that has been in the same spot long enough to stop registering. On the morning of the 5th of September, the same print was a different kind of object, not because anything about the print had changed, because a story had arrived between those two mornings and reframed the print within it. The physical object on the wall was identical. What a person standing in front of it was now doing with their attention was not. That shift, the reframing of a familiar object by a story that arrives fully formed, with named incidents and professional witnesses, and the authority of a national newspaper behind it, happened in many thousands of households in those first days of September. It happened on doorsteps, at kitchen tables, in lunch breaks at work, where one person had read the story and told another who had not. The speed at which a story of this kind travels is determined partly by how widely the trigger is distributed, and a front-page story in one of Britain's highest circulation papers was a very widely distributed trigger. It landed simultaneously in front of many people who all owned the same object. The conditions for rapid and broad spread were essentially ideal. The woman in Glasgow reading the follow-up coverage at her kitchen table, glancing over her shoulder at the print in the hallway, was not one person. She was the representative of a very large group of people having a recognizably similar morning in recognizably similar circumstances. The print in the hallway was unremarkable on Tuesday. It was something different on Friday. Not all of those people wrote to the Sun. Many of them simply stood in their hallways for a moment, looking. Some of them began, in the weeks that followed, to notice small things, minor domestic events, a cracked tile, a fuse that blew, a cold that settled in, that in other circumstances they would have set aside without remark. In these circumstances, they had a pattern to fit the events into. The pattern had been given to them by the paper, fully assembled, ready to receive whatever small and inconclusive evidence daily life might provide. In a fire station common room in South Yorkshire, in the autumn of that year, a group of firefighters sat around a table during a shift break. This is one of the images the story generated and preserved, specific enough to be pictured, general enough to stand in for others like it. One of them held up a copy of the paper and pointed to the photograph of the print. The conversation that followed around that table was not recorded, but its basic shape can be inferred. They would have been going over what they had seen at fire scenes. They would have been deciding, informally, and in the way that groups do, what weight to give it. They would have been noticing and naming and comparing notes. The story had given them a way to organize observations they might previously have made and set aside. Whether those observations, organized within that frame, pointed to what the story said they pointed to was something the table could not resolve. The conversation had the quality of a genuinely open question, the kind that a group of people in a common room can turn over without arriving at an answer, and then set down and return to the next time someone brings in a copy of the paper. The follow-up coverage continued to drive the conversation. Each new article gathered in more reported incidents, extended the geography further, and added new dimensions to what was already a well-defined central claim. A story that had arrived in one dramatic burst on the 4th of September now had a continuing presence in the paper across weeks, each new installment arriving like additional mail from a correspondent who had more to say and whose dispatches were reliably interesting. The readers who had written in were part of the story now, their letters quoted and their locations added to the paper's informal mapping of the phenomenon. They had contributed to something larger than their individual accounts, and the paper was representing their contributions back to them and to its wider readership as evidence of a pattern that was expanding rather than contracting. What the reader letters produced, collectively, was something that functioned like a distributed record, not a formal archive, not documentation in the official sense, but a large body of reported personal experience, all organized around the same central object and the same central claim. The individual accounts varied enormously in their specificity and their tone. Some were matter-of-fact, describing a fire on a specific street in a specific year and the print that survived it. Some were reflective, describing a general sense of unease that had gathered around the print over time, or a feeling that had come and gone but never entirely left. Some were urgent, written by people who felt they needed the paper to know what they knew. Some were tentative, written by people who were not sure they believed what they were describing, but felt, given the circumstances, that they ought to describe it anyway. What they had in common was the object, the weeping child's face, the dark background, The print that had been on the wall for years and now required accounting for. An editor at the Sun in those weeks was opening envelopes from every corner of Britain. The envelopes were from strangers. The stories inside them were from strangers. The handwriting on the paper varied enormously, neat and careful in some, hurried and tilted in others, the particular private handwriting of private people who had decided for one reason or another to write to a newspaper about a painting on their wall. The volume of correspondence was, by any measure, very large. The editor setting each letter onto the growing stack was participating in something that had no real precedent in the paper's experience. A reader response generated not by a tragedy, not by a political controversy, not by a competition or a campaign, but by a front-page story about a painting and what firefighters had found near it. The stack grew. The stories arrived from postcodes. The paper had not yet mapped. The painted weeping face moved through the coverage like a fixed point around which all the reported variation could organize itself. Every letter that arrived was different in its particulars and the same in its center. The print, the wall, the story, the paper had told, and whatever the writer felt they were contributing to, or confirming by writing back. By the time the coverage began to settle, toward the later weeks of October, the story had achieved something that most tabloid front pages do not achieve. It had moved from a single day's report into an extended, participatory, geographically distributed conversation. It had given a generation of British households a reason to think, possibly for the first time, about an object they had owned and lived with for years, as though it were a character with a history. The prints had come from market stalls and mail-order catalogs sold in the shillings, hung above sideboards in terraced houses across the country. They had been unremarkable. They were no longer unremarkable. The story had done that. A front page, a bold headline, the face of a weeping child reproduced in newsprint gray. These had made ordinary domestic wall space into something that invited a different kind of attention. None of this required the incidents to be confirmed. The story did not need verification to do what it did in those weeks. Reported incidents do not need to be documented in fire brigade files to change the way a person stands in front of an object they have owned for a decade. What they need to do is arrive in a form that is recognizable, specific, and plausible, and the form of Mick Riley's quoted testimony of a fire-gutted room with a face-down print on the blackened floor was all three of those things. It was specific enough to hold in the mind. It was plausible enough not to require active disbelief. It was recognizable enough that anyone who owned a similar print could immediately and concretely imagine the same scene in their own home. The newspaper was, in this sense, doing what newspapers do well. It was giving a specific and vivid form to a pattern that, once named, could be noticed everywhere. The pattern had always been available. There were many prints, many fires, many years of overlapping distribution, but it had not been noticed as a pattern until the paper named it and gave it a face. Once named, the pattern was visible in the letters that flooded in, which confirmed it and extended it, which generated further coverage, which brought in further letters. The cycle was self-sustaining. It did not require a supernatural object to run. It required a story with a fixed center, a large and distributed readership, and enough uncertainty in the original claim to allow anyone who owned the relevant object to become a participant rather than merely an observer. What happened in those September weeks was genuine. The letters were real. The firefighter's testimony was published in a national paper. The reader response was one of the largest the paper had recorded. The geographic spread of reported incidents was very wide. All of these things are documented and not disputed. What they are is a body of reported experience organized around a central claim, and reported experience, organized in this way, is the material from which lasting legends are built, without necessarily requiring that the central claim be settled in either direction. On an editor's desk, in those weeks, the stack of handwritten envelopes was growing into something substantial. Each new letter added to a body of material that had, by this point, its own mass and momentum. The letters came from towns that had not appeared in earlier coverage. Some were from small places, villages, market towns, stretches of rural road between larger settlements, where a person had read the story, thought about the print their grandmother had left them, and decided to write. The handwriting on these later letters was the same as the handwriting on the earlier ones, private, particular, the marks of someone who had something to say and had found, in this specific newspaper story, the occasion to say it. One more envelope arrived on the stack. It was postmarked from a town not yet represented in the paper's informal geography, one of those places that the pin map, if anyone had been maintaining one formally, had not yet reached. Inside it, in handwriting that slanted slightly to the left, was another account from another household, another weeping face in another hallway, another small and particular story that had found the larger story it was now a part of. It was added to the stack. The stack was very tall. The story had traveled much further than any single morning's front page could have been expected to carry it, into post boxes and kitchens and common rooms and hallways where prints had been hanging, undisturbed for years, and were now, quietly and without drama, being looked at again. A thin, nearly transparent layer of varnish sits on the surface of a printed image. Under a magnifying glass, held close and tilted slowly toward the light, it resolves into something more interesting than it first appears. A continuous, unbroken skin stretched across the entire face of the print, sealed at every edge, smooth and slightly elastic where a fingernail traces it, catching the light in a way the paper beneath it does not. In normal room light, at normal viewing distance, it is effectively invisible. The image appears to be simply an image, ink on paper, colors held in their arrangement by nothing more than the paper's own surface. The varnish does not announce itself. It sits there quietly, doing very little, asking nothing of the people who hang the print on the wall and walk past it every day for 20 years without giving it a second thought. This coating was not applied with fire in mind. That much is worth saying plainly. Commercial lithographic prints of the 1960s and 1970s were treated with synthetic polymer varnishes as a matter of routine production practice, for reasons entirely to do with durability and surface finish. Alkyd resins, acrylic polymers, nitrocellulose-based lacquers. The specific formulation varied from print house to print house, and the records of exactly which compounds were used on any particular run of reproductions are not the kind of documentation that survives in archives. What survives is the chemistry itself, still present on the surface of prints that have spent decades in living rooms and hallways and storage, still performing its original function of sealing the ink against moisture and abrasion, holding the image intact against the ordinary slow erosion of domestic life. The layer is thin. It is not armor. It was never designed to resist anything more dramatic than the occasional wipe of a damp cloth. And yet, in certain very specific and well understood circumstances, something in this ordinary coating behaves in a way that turns out to matter considerably. The process is called char barrier formation. It is not unusual or difficult to understand, though the name makes it sound more specialized than it is. When certain synthetic coatings are exposed to the kind of sustained, rising heat that a compartment fire produces, they do not simply melt or burn away in the way that bare paper would. Instead, as the temperature climbs through ranges that would cause unprotected paper to char and ignite, some polymer coatings begin to carbonize at the surface, forming a thin, dense crust of charred material that sits at the boundary between the heat source and the substrate beneath it. This char layer is not fireproof. Given enough time and enough heat, it will eventually yield, but in the compressed, variable, asymmetric time frame of a real house fire, where temperatures shift unevenly across a room, where fuel loads are irregular, where the fire moves through the space in directions governed by airflow and the arrangement of furniture and the location of doorways, even a small delay in heat penetration can be the difference between a surface that survives and one that does not. A fire in a domestic room does not distribute its heat evenly. This is one of the more important things fire engineering research has established about what happens inside a burning compartment, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before moving on. The ceiling is much hotter than the floor. Thermal layering, the stratification of hot gases and cooler air, means that the upper part of a room during an active fire can reach temperatures that would destroy almost any common material, while the lower portions of the same room, at floor level, remain comparatively much cooler for a significant portion of the fire's duration. The heat rises, the smoke rises, the flame rises. The floor, paradoxically, is often the safest place in a burning room, at least until the fire has been burning long enough and at high enough intensity for the thermal gradient to collapse, which in a typical domestic compartment fire does not happen immediately. A framed print hangs on a wall. The wall itself is, in most British working-class homes of the 1970s, a plastered brick or plastered block construction, a dense, thermally massive material that absorbs heat slowly, that does not itself contribute to the fire load, and that sits behind the print, acting as a kind of thermal buffer. The wall conducts heat, yes, but it conducts it far more slowly than the open air of the room. A print hanging against masonry is, without anyone having planned this, sitting in one of the cooler microenvironments available to it in a burning room, insulated from behind by stone and plaster, potentially still facing a space where the fire has not yet reached its peak intensity. Then there is the frame itself, and the glass. The physical construction of a framed print is, from a materials science perspective, a modest but real layered system. The glass sits at the front, facing outward into the room. Behind it, the surface of the print. Behind the print, a backing board, typically cardboard or thin hardboard in the prints of this era. And behind the backing board, the wall. Each of these layers behaves differently under heat. The glass, in particular, does something interesting. Its thermal conductivity is low enough, and its specific heat capacity high enough, that it slows the rate at which heat reaches the paper's surface on the other side. This is not indefinite protection. Glass will eventually crack, and once it cracks, the insulating microenvironment it has been maintaining collapses. But glass cracks at different rates depending on how it is heated, how uniform the heat is across its surface, and how quickly the surrounding temperature is rising. In the uneven, rapidly shifting conditions of a domestic fire, a pane of glass can persist for a surprisingly long time. Behind the glass, in the thin gap between the glazing and the print surface, something else is happening. A small enclosed pocket of air sits in that space. It is not much, a few millimeters of depth, sealed at the edges by the frame's rebate. But that enclosed air is not circulating. It cannot transfer heat through convection in the way that the open air of the room does. It is a still layer, and still air is a remarkably effective insulator. The glass slows the heat. The still air in the gap slows it further. The polymer varnish on the print's surface may form its char barrier. And behind all of this, the wall continues to absorb heat at its own slow, massive rate, holding the temperature at the back of the frame lower than the temperature at the front. None of this is sufficient to make a framed print proof against fire. A severe, sustained, well-developed fire in a small room will eventually overwhelm these modest layers of protection, one after another, and destroy whatever is inside the frame along with everything else. The point is not that framed prints cannot burn. The point is that they are not as vulnerable as a bare sheet of paper would be, and that the specific combination of factors, varnish, glass, air gap, masonry backing, creates a system in which survival under certain fire conditions is not extraordinary. It is, in the right circumstances, predictable. Investigators from the UK Fire Research Station, the body responsible for the scientific study of fire behavior in Britain through the 1980s, noted in their general research on fire-damaged domestic interiors that framed wall-mounted objects can survive fires through a combination of exactly these factors. Their distance from primary fuel loads matters. The direction of fire spread matters. The thermal protection offered by masonry walls behind them matters. These are not exotic or controversial observations. They are the kind of careful, methodical findings that accumulate in fire investigation science over decades of examining burned rooms and recording precisely what was destroyed and what was not, and building from those records a picture of how fire actually behaves inside the particular geometry and material composition of the rooms people live in. There is one more factor, and it is perhaps the most elegant of them. When a domestic fire has been burning long enough for it to structurally damage the room, when the heat softens the plaster, when the fixings that hold objects to walls begin to weaken, or the wall itself begins to give way, framed prints fall. A nail set into a wall will hold its load through a great deal of ordinary heat stress, but a sustained fire, working on the plaster around it, will eventually cause the material to give. The frame drops, and when a framed print falls from a wall in a burning room, the question of where it lands and in what orientation becomes, from a fire survival perspective, a significant question. A print that falls face down lands with its glass face resting against the floor. The floor is, as established, the coolest part of the room. The floor is also, typically, a hard, thermally dense surface, concrete, tile, or compressed floorboard that does not itself readily burn. The print's image surface is now sealed between two layers, the glass below it, against the cool floor, and the backing board above it, facing upward into the hotter upper zone of the room. The glass protects the image from below. The backing board burns from above, acting as a sacrificial layer that consumes itself before the heat can penetrate through to the paper underneath. The image lies in the most protected position it could occupy in the room, low, face down, insulated on both sides, while the fire continues above it. A fire investigator walking into a gutted room after the fire has been extinguished finds a print lying face down on the blackened floor, its back scorched and its frame carbonized, but its image, when turned over, unscorched. The investigator photographs it. The investigator records its position in a notebook. The investigator notes the position of the fire's probable origin, the direction of spread, the location of primary fuel loads, the height at which the wall fixings would have given way. The survival of the print is not treated as extraordinary. It is recorded as a data point in a full investigation of what happened in that room. One item in a list of items destroyed, damaged or preserved, each one telling part of the story of how the fire moved. This, taken together, is the physical picture. It is worth spending some time with it, not because the explanation reduces the painting to something less interesting, but because the actual mechanics of fire survival are in their own way as worth attending to as anything else about this story. A varnish layer that was applied for reasons of surface finish and market durability turns out, in a specific set of fire conditions, to behave as a char barrier. A pane of glass that was put into the frame to protect the print from dust and handling turns out to slow convective heat transfer in ways its manufacturer never considered. An air gap too small to notice traps still air that insulates the surface beneath it, and a falling print lands in the orientation that is most protective because gravity pulls it toward the floor, and the floor is the coolest place in the room. None of these features were designed for fire survival. They were designed, or they simply came about, for entirely mundane reasons. The varnish was there to make the print look glossy and last well on a wall. The glass was there because framed prints come with glass. The backing board was there because frames need something behind the print to keep it flat. And the wall was masonry because that is how most British working-class houses of that era were built, brick or block, plastered, dense, slow to heat. The Crying Boy's survival in house fires, when it did survive, was not the result of protection placed on the painting with intention or care. It was the result of an ordinary commercial object made of ordinary materials, behaving according to the ordinary rules of physics in a situation where those rules happen to work in its favor. The materials science of this, considered slowly, is not a deflation of the story. It is the story, seen from a different angle. Consider what it means to say that a polymer varnish forms a char barrier. The coating is applied at room temperature, is dry in minutes, and sits inert on the print's surface for years or decades without doing anything at all. It is not waiting. It has no mechanism for anticipation. It simply has a chemistry, a specific combination of molecular bonds that, when exposed to a specific range of temperatures over a specific time frame, breaks down in a particular way that happens to produce a carbonized surface layer. The char barrier forms not because the coating is protecting anything, but because of what carbon compounds do when they are heated. The distinction sounds obvious. It is worth making explicit anyway, because the gap between what happens and why it happens is where the impression of intentionality can take hold, quietly, in the space between one sentence and the next. The glass cracks. It does not hold. No glass holds indefinitely against a sustained fire, and the survival of a print through the glass intact phase of a fire is partly a matter of timing, of whether the fire burns intensely enough, for long enough, in close enough proximity to the frame, to crack the glass before other factors intervene. In fires where the glass cracks early, the insulating system collapses, and the print has no more protection than a bare sheet of paper. In fires where the glass holds through the critical period, where the print falls face down before the glass gives, or where the fire's intensity at that location never reaches the threshold required, survival is, within the parameters established by the physics, entirely expected. The variation in outcomes across reported incidents is, from this perspective, not surprising. Some prints survive, some do not. What determines which outcome occurs is not the print's identity or any property of its image. What determines it is the geometry of the fire, the position of the print relative to the fire's origin, the direction of spread, the fuel load in the immediate vicinity, the time from ignition to intervention by the fire brigade, the structural composition of the wall behind the print. and the specific moment at which the fixing gives way and the print falls. These are variables that differ from one fire to the next. They are also variables that individually are each well understood. A fire researcher reading an account of a surviving print in a burned room would not reach for an explanation involving the unusual properties of the image. A fire researcher would reach for a notepad and begin asking about wall construction, fuel load distribution, fire duration, and the orientation in which the print was found. The answers to those questions, in almost every case, are sufficient to account for what was observed without invoking anything beyond materials behavior and fire dynamics. The specific case described in early press coverage, a framed print found face down on the floor of a gutted room, its image unscorched and its glass unbroken, maps precisely onto the scenario that fire physics predicts would produce this outcome. Face down on the floor, the print is in the lowest, coolest zone of the room, with its image surface against the glass and the glass against the floor. Glass unbroken, the print fell before the glass reached cracking temperature, or the glass fell into conditions that never reached that temperature. Image unscorched, the image surface was sealed between the glass below and the varnish layer above, in a position where neither radiant heat from the room above nor conductive heat from the floor had sufficient intensity or duration to penetrate to the paper. This is not a reconstruction. This is what the physics says should happen when a varnished glass-fronted print falls face down onto a concrete or tile floor in a room where the fire is burning above it. There is also a more practical observation that fire investigators of the period made about the specific pattern of reported survivals. Mass-produced commercial prints of the kind sold through chain stores and market stalls in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s were a relatively uniform product. They used similar paper stocks, similar inks, similar varnish formulations, similar glass grades, similar backing board materials, and similar frame constructions. The Crying Boy print was not uniquely constructed. It was one of thousands of products assembled from the same materials to the same specifications, using the same manufacturing processes. Any framed print made to the same standard would, in the right fire conditions, behave in the same way as a surviving Crying Boy print. What differed was not the object, but the notice taken of the object, a point that is worth holding. Before September 1985, a framed print surviving a house fire was not in itself remarkable enough to report in a newspaper. A fire investigator recording the scene would note it. A householder might mention it to their neighbors, but it was not in the general cultural field a fact charged with meaning. After September 1985, the discovery of any intact Crying Boy print at a fire scene was a finding that had acquired a name, a narrative context, a ready-made story that could receive it. The discovery had not changed. What had changed was the interpretive frame through which the discovery was understood. That frame was built, as frames tend to be, from something that had happened before the fire, something read in a newspaper, something a neighbor had mentioned, something that was already in the air of the room where the fire began. The fire investigator's job is, in this context, an interesting one. The investigator works backward from physical evidence to cause and sequence, from the pattern of char and ash and heat damage across the surfaces of a room, back to the story of how the fire started and how it spread. This is disciplined work. It requires the investigator to hold what they know about fire behavior as a framework for reading what they find, and to resist the pull of narratives that explain the evidence in other ways. A surviving print is evidence of fire behavior, materials behavior, and geometry. It is recorded as such. The investigator notes the position, the orientation, the condition of the glass and backing, the location relative to the fire's origin. These notes accumulate across many investigations and form a body of professional knowledge about how framed objects behave in fires. That body of knowledge is quiet. It does not generate front-page headlines. It lives in technical reports and fire investigation training materials, and the accumulated practical experience of people who spend their professional lives in burned rooms, reading the evidence that fire leaves behind. It is the kind of knowledge that does not travel easily into general conversation because it requires some prior familiarity with fire dynamics to follow, and because it does not have the structural simplicity of the narrative that reached millions of people through a newspaper. But the knowledge is there. It has been there in professional fire investigation practice throughout the entire period during which the Crying Boy's reputation has circulated. The explanation for what fire investigators found in those gutted rooms was available in the technical literature while the story was still making headlines. It did not resolve the public narrative because that narrative was not primarily about fire behavior. It was about something else, about what it means to find an intact image of a weeping child in a house that is burned, about the specific disquiet that image produces, about what the mind reaches for when it encounters something that looks, from a certain angle, like the exception to a rule. The char barrier, and the glass, and the still air, and the cool floor, all of these are the rule, working as it should, in the precise conditions required for it to produce the outcome that was observed. They are not the exception. The exception would be a print, surviving a well-developed compartment fire with full thermal exposure on all surfaces and no masonry protection and no face-down orientation and no varnish layer. That print has not been documented because physics has not yet been found to work differently for mass-produced commercial lithographs than for any other object made from the same materials in the same way. A fire investigator stands in a blackened room. The morning light comes in through a window frame that has no glass left in it, and the light falls across the floor in a flat, clear rectangle. The smell of a burned room is specific and total. It occupies every breath and sits in the fabric of clothing for hours afterward. The investigator crouches at the center of the room and looks at the distribution of damage across the floor, reading the pattern as a person reads a page, following the evidence in the direction it points. The print is there on the floor, face down, its back carbonized, its frame intact enough to show the original finish along the edges where the temperature never reached the char threshold. The investigator turns it over, photographs the image surface, photographs the floor beneath it, notes the orientation relative to the room's doorway and windows, and writes in a notebook the words that this physical scene requires. The words are not about curses, and they are about surface temperatures and heat flux and the geometry of thermal exposure in a closed compartment during a domestic fire that lasted from the pattern of the damage approximately 45 minutes before suppression. The words record what the materials did under those conditions, because that is the record the evidence supports. The words are precise and particular and sufficient. They do not reach for more than the evidence gives them, and the evidence in this room on this morning gives them everything needed to understand what happened here. The notebook closes. The pen is capped. The investigator stands, notes the time, and moves to the next part of the room, where a different pattern of damage waits to be read in the same patient, methodical way. The thin varnish layer that began all of this is not visible from where the investigator stands. It is too small to see with the naked eye, and in any case the print has been through a fire, and its surface is no longer simply the surface it was before. But the varnish layer did what its chemistry required it to do. in the conditions that required it to do something, and the image on the other side of the glass is intact and specific and clear, the same face it always was, with the same expression it always carried, holding the same glistening tear in the same position on the painted cheek, patient and unchanged and quietly accounted for. The mystery of the surviving print, examined from this angle, resolves into a sequence of physical events that follow one from another, with the straightforward internal logic of materials behaving according to their properties. The sequence begins with a commercial decision to apply a polymer varnish to a print for reasons of surface quality and shelf durability. The sequence ends with a fire investigator writing notes in a burned room and arriving at the same conclusion that fire physics, applied carefully, would have predicted from the start. Between these 2 points, a great deal of interpretation accumulated, the kind of interpretation that is not generated by the evidence itself, but by the readiness of the mind to find, in the gap between what it expected and what it found, something that requires a larger explanation. The evidence does not require a larger explanation. It requires a patient one, and patience applied to the physical facts of what fire does and does not destroy is more than sufficient. There is something worth noting in the specific quality of the explanation, not because it resolves the story, but because of what it reveals about the objects around which stories accumulate. A framed print survives a fire. The survival is recorded. The recording is combined with similar recordings from other fires. The combination acquires a name and a narrative. The narrative travels. And meanwhile, in the technical literature, the physical account sits undisturbed, precise, sufficient, patient, not competing with the narrative, simply remaining available for anyone who asks the question from the direction the evidence faces. The fire investigator writes the final line of the notebook entry, closes the book, and tucks it under one arm. The light through the empty window frame is steady and clear. The print lies on the floor where it was found, recorded in its condition and position, awaiting collection as evidence. In the notation of the investigation, it is object number 14 in a room that has yielded 22 items of evidentiary interest. It is listed between a melted clock and a section of skirting board whose char pattern indicates the fire's direction of travel. It is neither more nor less significant than either of these things in the context of a methodical investigation of a domestic fire in a terraced house in a British town on an ordinary morning. It is simply what the materials and the physics and the geometry of the room produced, recorded accurately, set down in writing, and left as the calm and grounded answer to a question that had for a time seemed to want a different kind of answer altogether. A hand is reaching across a table toward a piece of fudge. The fudge is brown and soft and has been shaped carefully to look like a small pile of dog droppings. The person reaching is a university student, well educated, fully aware that the object in front of them is just chocolate and sugar and nothing else. The researcher sitting across from them has explained this clearly. There is no ambiguity about what the object is, and still the hand hesitates. It slows as it approaches, and then it stops, hovering a few centimeters above the table surface. And the student laughs, a slightly embarrassed laugh, a laugh that acknowledges the absurdity of the pause, and tries again, and stops again. The fudge is just fudge. The hand knows this. Some other part of the person does not quite agree. This was one of the experiments conducted by Paul Rosen, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, in research that began in the 1980s and continued through the following decade. Rosen was interested in what he called contagion thinking, the intuitive sense that objects can absorb properties from the things or people associated with them, and that those absorbed properties can transfer to anyone who subsequently touches or owns or simply inhabits the same space as the object. The fudge experiment was testing a specific version of this, the idea that an object that resembles something contaminating will trigger contagion intuitions, even when the participant fully understands that the resemblance is superficial and the substance is harmless. What Rosen found across many participants and many variations of the experiment was that the hesitation was not unusual. It was the norm. Most people paused. Most people laughed at themselves for pausing, and most of them paused anyway. Working with his colleague Carol Nemiroff, Rosen extended these experiments into a broader map of contagion intuitions. They found that most people showed reluctance to wear a sweater that had been worn by someone they found morally objectionable, even after the sweater had been dry cleaned. The dry cleaning mattered less than the history. The cleaning was a physical fact. The history was a felt one. Participants who were asked to drink from a glass that had briefly held apple juice, then been emptied and thoroughly washed, showed measurable reluctance if they had seen a dead cockroach dropped into the glass, even though they were told the glass was clean, even though they understood intellectually that the washing had removed anything that could be called a contaminant. The discomfort was not in the glass. It was in the knowledge of what the glass had once contained. What Rosen and Nemiroff argued, on the basis of this work, was not that their participants were confused or poorly reasoned. The argument was quieter than that. Contagion thinking, they suggested, is a feature of normal human cognition that operates in parallel with rational assessment, rather than instead of it. A person can fully believe that the dry clean sweater is clean and simultaneously feel reluctant to put it on. Both things are true at once. The rational belief does not dissolve the intuitive response. They coexist, and in practice, the intuitive response often wins, quietly, without drama, in the form of a slight preference, a minor avoidance, a hand that hesitates above a table, and then tries again and hesitates once more. This kind of thinking shows up reliably in populations that have no particular reason to hold it. It appears in secular, educated, urbanized communities. It appears in people who explicitly describe themselves as non-superstitious. It appears in scientists, engineers, and philosophers when the experimental conditions are arranged carefully enough. Rosen and Nemiroff were careful to note that they were not documenting a failure of rationality. They were documenting a cognitive tendency that appears to be quite old and quite broadly distributed across human minds, one that rational education can overlay but rarely fully extinguishes. The hand reaching toward the fudge and stopping was not doing something strange. It was doing something very ordinary. Bruce Hood is a developmental psychologist who has spent a significant part of his career studying exactly this territory. His research, gathered and extended in a book published in 2009, found that what Rosen and Nemiroff had documented in adults could also be traced through the ways children understand objects and their histories. Children develop object attachment and contamination sensitivity earlier than developmental models had previously predicted, and the form those intuitions take in childhood is not simply erased as the child becomes more cognitively sophisticated. Hood argued that these intuitive responses are not bugs in the system. They are, in some functional sense, part of how the system was built. The adult who hesitates before the fudge is not failing to mature out of a childish belief. The adult is expressing something that development did not remove, because development does not appear to have been arranged to remove it. Hood conducted his own experiments with adults on the question of designated unlucky or cursed objects. Conditions where participants were told that an ordinary-looking object, a cardigan, a pen, a small ornament, had been designated cursed, and then explicitly told that this designation was fictional. A significant portion of participants continued to show reluctance to interact with it. The label had done something that the retraction of the label could not fully undo. Once an object has been placed in the category of things that carry a negative designation, the mind returns it to that category with some persistence, even when it also accepts the label is not real. Hood described this as a tendency toward what he called an inferential signature, the mind's disposition to treat objects as potentially carrying properties that are not visible on their surfaces and that cannot be simply removed by being told they are not there. A person who reads a story about a particular painting, a story that places the painting in a specific category of objects that have been associated with harm, is performing a cognitive operation that has real effects on how they subsequently see that painting. The painting does not change. The paint does not change. The canvas or the print or the sheet of paper does not change. But the category the painting now occupies has changed, and that category exerts a quiet pressure on how the painting is perceived and on what subsequent events involving the painting are noticed and remembered and connected to it. This is where confirmation bias enters, and it enters with considerable force. The research on heuristic thinking associated with the psychologist Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky accumulated across decades of careful experimental work established with great precision how readily human attention selects, from among the many events of daily life, the events that confirm a belief already held. This selectivity is not deliberate. It is not calculated. Most people would sincerely deny doing it. But the selection happens anyway, operating below the threshold of conscious attention, arranging the evidence that a person notices and retains in a way that tends to support what that person already believes. Consider the practical consequences of this for someone who has read the story of the crying boy painting and has a copy of the print hanging in their home. Minor domestic misfortunes happen at a roughly constant rate in any household. A glass breaks, an appliance fails, a child falls and skins a knee, a bill arrives for an amount that was not expected. Before the story was read, these events were categorized as ordinary, the unremarkable friction of daily life in a household with objects and people and small, unpredictable chances. After the story has been read, a new category is available. Some of these events will now, without any deliberate intention, become available for reattribution. The broken glass might be filed under the painting. The bill might be filed under the painting. The tendency is not to reclassify all misfortunes. That would be too obvious, too much for the rational layer of the mind to accept. The tendency is more subtle. It is to notice, with a quality of mild unease, when something goes wrong in the way that one notices a pattern one has been primed to notice. This priming effect is cumulative. The more times a small misfortune is noticed in conjunction with the awareness of the painting, the more available the connection becomes the next time. The cognitive path between painting and misfortune becomes, through repetition, a slightly more well-worn path. It does not become a belief exactly. It remains in the register of what some researchers call a feeling of knowing, not a proposition held consciously as true, but a persistent background inclination that shapes attention without quite rising to the surface as a claim. Many people who report unease about a cursed object are not, when pressed, willing to state explicitly that they believe in the curse. They describe something more like a preference to be cautious, a sense that it is not worth the risk, a feeling that they would rather the object not be in their home, even though they cannot fully say why. The image itself may contribute something to this. Research on the psychological effects of imagery depicting suffering has suggested that images of distress and grief can influence the emotional tone of a domestic space in ways that residents do not always consciously trace to the artwork. A painting of a weeping child on a living room wall is not simply a neutral rectangle of color. It depicts something, a particular emotional state, rendered with enough technical skill to make the depicted emotion legible to the viewer's own emotional processing. Every time a person passes the painting, some version of the depicted grief is processed. The processing may be rapid and shallow. It may never rise to conscious notice. But the accumulation of rapid, shallow processings across weeks and months may contribute to a mild, ambient emotional quality in the space, a background note of something slightly sad or slightly heavy that the inhabitants of the room are never quite able to account for. This is not mysticism. It is a fairly straightforward consequence of how the visual system and the emotional system interact. Humans are highly responsive to depicted facial expressions. The face of a weeping child on a wall is processed by the relevant neural machinery in a way that a geometric pattern is not. The response is automatic. It is part of what makes figurative art, as distinct from abstract art, so consistently powerful. The depicted face recruits the viewer's own face processing and emotion reading systems without asking permission. A person may walk past the crying boy print 50 times and think consciously about it twice, but on each of the 50 passings, some small portion of their emotional processing engages with the depicted distress. The cumulative effect of this, across the time the print is in the home, may be genuinely subtle, but subtle is not the same as nothing. The psychologist David Friedberg approached this territory from a different direction. His scholarly work, published in 1989, assembled a wide-ranging body of evidence for the proposition that human beings have never, across any period or culture, related to images as purely inert objects. Friedberg's archive included records of images being kissed, images being carried in procession as though they possessed agency, images being attacked and destroyed because of a belief that the destruction would affect the thing the image depicted. He found these responses in ancient Greece, in medieval Europe, in early modern China, and in 20th century accounts from many different cultural settings. He was not arguing that images do have power in any supernatural sense. He was arguing that the tendency to respond to images as though they do is a consistent feature of human visual cognition, consistent enough across time and culture that it seems to be built in rather than taught. A medieval European scribe, in a document Friedberg examined with careful attention, recorded with matter-of-fact notarial precision that a religious painting in a local church had been reported to weep. The scribe did not editorialize. He did not frame the event as a miracle. He did not frame it as a hoax. He recorded it the way he might record the dimensions of a field or the terms of a contract, as a fact that required documentation. What the document reveals is not whether the painting wept, but that the category of image that weeps was available to the people of that time and place, and that it was available as something documentable, rather than as something inherently astonishing. The weeping image was an expected possibility. It fit within a framework of how images were understood to behave. This framework has thinned in modern secular societies, but Friedberg's argument was that it has not disappeared. It has gone underground. It continues to operate beneath the surface of rational secular self-description, expressing itself in the hesitation before a designated cursed object, in the reluctance to destroy an image of a loved person, even when the image itself is just paper and ink, in the persistent sense that certain objects carry more than their material properties suggest. The secular rational person who feels mildly uncomfortable passing a print of a weeping child in a hallway, and who does not know why, is not failing to be secular or failing to be rational. They are expressing a very old cognitive pattern that secularism and rationalism have not had the duration or the mechanism to remove. The folklore scholar's term for objects believed to carry agency or power is a loaded object, a term that does not require belief in the agency to be descriptive. Any object around which enough cultural story has accumulated becomes loaded in this functional sense. It becomes an object that people relate to differently from how they relate to objects without that accumulated story. A shirt that belonged to a famous person is a shirt. The shirt that belonged to a famous person is something else, something that people will pay considerably more for, touch with more attention, keep with more care, because the story around it has loaded it with a significance that its material properties alone do not account for. The Crying Boy print, after 1985, was a loaded object in exactly this sense. The story around it had changed how it was held and handled and related to in a way that the physical print itself did not account for. There is a Japanese tradition that provides one of the oldest systematic frameworks for understanding this kind of object loading. The tradition of Tsukumogami holds that household objects acquire spiritual presence after having existed for a long period of time, typically 100 years. Objects that have been used, cared for, and lived alongside for long enough become, in this framework, animate in some sense. They have accumulated the residue of all that contact. The illustrated catalogs of Tsukumogami, produced in ink on paper with great delicacy, depict old sandals with faces, worn lanterns with limbs, ancient scrolls with expressions. The images are not, in the tradition's own terms, metaphors. They are documentation. They record what an object becomes when it has been in the world long enough to absorb the world's attention. The Crying Boy print spent decades in British living rooms and hallways. It was looked at, passed, noticed, and ignored with the particular quality of daily domestic attention that falls on familiar objects, the kind of attention that is not quite looking and not quite ignoring, but something in between. Across those decades, the accumulated attention of thousands of households settled onto the print in the way that attention settles onto things that are always there. When the 1985 story arrived and placed the print in a new category, all of that accumulated attention was reframed at once. The unremarkable familiar object became an object with a history, and objects with histories are objects that have been, in some functional sense, loaded. It is worth pausing on what the 1985 story actually offered the people who read it, setting aside entirely the question of whether any of the reported events were literally accurate. What the story offered was a framework. It took an object that was present in a great many British homes, an object that had been unremarkable and ambient and essentially invisible in the way that familiar decorations become invisible, and it gave that object a story. The story had a structure that is recognizable across many curse narratives. An object, a pattern of harm associated with the object, a specific documented case that anchors the pattern, and a community of people who recognize and share the pattern. This structure is satisfying to the pattern-finding mind. It is the structure of an explanation, even if the thing it explains is itself uncertain. Explanations are, for most minds, preferable to the absence of explanation. A great deal of research on narrative cognition has suggested that the human mind is strongly disposed towards story-shaped accounts of events, accounts with causes and consequences, with patterns and structures, with objects and agents whose interactions produce outcomes. A domestic fire is a terrible and frightening event. Domestic fires have causes, and those causes are often mundane and in some sense undramatic. An electrical fault, an unextinguished cigarette, a pan left unattended. The mundane cause is accurate, but not particularly shapeable into narrative. A cursed painting is a cause that has shape, that has pattern, that connects a local frightening event to a wider community of people who share the same object and the same story. The curse narrative does something the electrical fault cannot do. It makes the fire part of something larger. It gives the event a place in a structure that extends beyond the immediate and particular. Scholars of urban legend have noted that stories tend to spread most rapidly when they address anxieties that are genuinely present in the communities that receive them. The 1985 Crying Boy story arrived in Britain at a time when a great many working-class households had the print on their walls. The story was not abstract. It was immediately, personally relevant to the people who received it, because the object at the center of the story was an object they owned, an object they had chosen for their homes, an object that was part of the texture of their daily life. The intimacy of the object was part of what gave the story its particular grip. It was not a story about something distant or imagined. It was a story about something they could see from where they were sitting when they read it. The psychologist's phrase for the cognitive state that follows this kind of experience is relevance inflation, the sudden increase in the felt significance of an ambient object or detail once a story has been encountered that connects to it. The print that was invisible on the wall an hour before reading the story is no longer invisible an hour after. It is the same print, the same dark background, the same tear-tracked child's face. But it is now visible in a way it was not, and its visibility carries a quality it did not carry before, and that quality is hard to name but easy to feel, the faint, warm weight of a story that has settled onto an object and changed how the object is held in awareness. None of this requires belief. The person who says with full sincerity that they do not believe in curses and do not believe the painting is responsible for any fire that has ever occurred, and who also feels slightly reluctant to hang the print in their bedroom, is not being inconsistent. They are being accurately human. The reluctance and the disbelief can coexist without resolving into each other, because they are products of different systems operating at different depths. The disbelief is held at the level of conscious reasoning. The reluctance is held at the level of intuition, and intuition does not take its cues from conscious reasoning in any simple or reliable way. Research on what psychologists call dual process cognition has mapped this split with increasing precision over the last several decades. The framework that emerges from that research describes the mind as running two overlapping systems, one that operates quickly, automatically, and on the basis of association and pattern, and one that operates more slowly, deliberately, and on the basis of inference and evidence. Both systems are real. Both are always running. The slower system can sometimes override the faster one, but it requires effort, and it does not always win, and even when it wins at the level of stated belief, the faster system continues to generate its own responses in the background, shaping attention and preference, and the mild physical unease of a hand that hovers above a table and cannot quite bring itself to close the distance. The Crying Boy print sits, for many of the people who have encountered its story, in exactly this space, consciously understood as a print, a commercial reproduction, a piece of lithographed paper in a mass-produced frame, simultaneously held at a different cognitive depth in a category that the 1985 story created, and that subsequent encounters with the story have continued to reinforce. The two ways of holding the object do not interfere with each other, they coexist. They have coexisted for decades in many thousands of minds, which is in itself a testament to how comfortably the human cognitive architecture accommodates what might look from the outside like a contradiction. The anthropologist Pascal Boyer has argued that supernatural concepts spread effectively across human minds, precisely because they are almost natural, because they conform to most of the expectations that ordinary conceptual categories generate, while violating just one or two of them in ways that make them memorable and worth passing on. A ghost is almost a person. A cursed object is almost an ordinary object. The violation of the expected, a person without a body, an object that carries harm, is small enough to be processed easily and large enough to stick. The mind files the concept in the right general category, notes the violation with the particular alertness that violations generate, and retains the whole package with an ease that purely ordinary concepts do not always achieve. A cursed painting is almost a painting. It has the right shape and the right surface and the right history of commercial production and domestic display. Everything about it conforms to the category of painting, except for one thing, which is that it is said to be connected to fires. The one violation is the memorable element. The rest of the concept is so ordinary that it requires no cognitive effort. And so the concept moves through minds and communities with a kind of friction-free ease that more exotic or elaborate supernatural claims cannot quite match. Because those claims require too much revision of too many ordinary expectations, and the revision is effortful, and effort is costly, and minds operating under ordinary conditions tend to prefer the lower cost option. This is why the crying boy story, once established, proved so durable. It did not require its recipients to believe in anything very far from what they already believed. It required only one small addition, that this particular ordinary object carried something beyond its material properties. The addition was small. The payoff in terms of narrative, in terms of community, in terms of the satisfying sense of having a frame for a frightening event, was considerable, and the cognitive cost of maintaining the addition, once made, was low enough that the mind did not have strong reason to reject it. The scholar Alan Dundas, in his work on the morphology of folk belief, described this as the economy of legend, the way successful legends are structured to minimize the cognitive effort required to hold them and maximize the narrative and social functions they serve. A legend that explains a frightening event, connects a community of people through a shared object, and provides a clear action to take in response, dispose of the object, participate in the burning, mail the print to the newspaper, is a legend that has solved several problems at once. Bedtime, it is in purely functional terms, a well-designed narrative technology. The fact that it may not be accurate as a causal account of house fires in no way diminishes its effectiveness as a piece of cognitive and social machinery. David Friedberg, seated in an archive surrounded by reproductions of images that people across many centuries and many cultures had kissed, attacked, wept before, carried in procession, anointed with oil, struck in fury, or destroyed in fear, was not in the end making a claim about the supernatural. He was making a claim about people. His claim was that the response to images as though they carry agency is not something that arrives with particular religious belief and departs when the belief is given up. It is something earlier than that, and deeper than that, and considerably more widespread. The scribe recording the weeping painting did not think he was recording something rare. The modern person who hesitates before an image designated cursed does not think they are doing something old. Both are wrong and in the same direction. What they are doing is ancient and durable and present in most minds that have ever looked at an image and felt in some way that resisted full accounting, that what they were looking at was looking back. The hand above the table eventually comes down. The student picks up the fudge and eats it and confirms what they already knew, that it is just chocolate and it tastes exactly like chocolate, and nothing further happens. The experiment ends. The researcher writes a note. The participant leaves. And the cognitive tendency that produced the hesitation goes with them quietly, because it has nowhere else to go, and because the architecture that contains it does not have a door through which it can be shown out. It is part of how the mind is made. Friedberg knew this. Rosen knew this. Hood knew this. And in the warm, ordinary rooms of mid-century British homes, in the daily, unremarkable presence of a framed weeping child on a hallway wall, something in the minds of the people who passed it knew it too, though they would not have used any of these words, and would not have needed to, because the knowledge was not the kind that required words to be present and real. A period-correct framed crying boy print sits on a table at a regional auction house, a white lot number sticker pressed to the lower right corner of the frame. The table is set out among other lots, a brass carriage clock, a set of dinner plates in a cardboard box, 2 wooden barometers leaned against each other, and the people gathered around it stand with the particular quiet that settles over a crowd when the object in front of them is already known. Nobody is reading the catalog description. Nobody needs to. The weeping child's face looks back at them through original glass, slightly hazed at the edges with the fine scratching of decades, and the small crowd stands a little closer to it than they do to the clock or the plates or the barometers, studying it the way people study things they have already decided are interesting. This is not a large auction. It is held on a weekday morning in a mid-sized British town, in a room with good light and slightly worn carpet, and most of what is on the tables has come from house clearances, the accumulated domestic life of homes that have changed hands. The crying boy print arrived this way, as it often does, wrapped in a single layer of newspaper and carried in by a man who said only that it had been on a wall in his late aunt's sitting room for as long as he could remember. The lot number sticker was applied without ceremony. The print was placed among the other things, and yet the small crowd gathered around it rather than around anything else, and they stood with that particular quiet, and they looked. The print itself is not rare. That is one of the more interesting things about it. In the late 1970s, there were versions of this image hanging in a very large number of British homes, and while many of those prints have not survived, given away, binned, destroyed in one of the organized removal campaigns that followed the 1985 newspaper coverage, or simply lost over the ordinary passage of time, enough of them remain that they circulate with some regularity through precisely this kind of auction, and through charity shops, and through the sorted and photographed listings of online marketplaces. A person who wished to own a period-correct framed crying boy print from the 1970s could, with patience, find one. The object has become the kind of thing people collect, and the collecting is driven by something that is not quite nostalgia, and not quite morbid interest, and not quite anything with a simple name, a kind of interested possession, the desire to hold the real version of a story in one's hands. Regional British auction houses have seen this kind of thing before, with other objects. A piece of furniture associated with an unlikely history, a ceramic figure from a production run that attracted a legend. The objects acquire a secondary interest that is layered over their material existence. They become carriers of narrative as well as things in themselves, and the narrative changes what it feels like to stand near them. The weeping child's face in its original 1970s frame is, in material terms, a lithographic print in a medium quality frame. In the terms of what it carries, it is something the people in this small auction room have been aware of for most of their lives, and their awareness of it is part of what they are paying for when the bidding begins. Bruno Amadio, the Venetian painter who made the original images under the name Giovanni Bragolin, did not design this second life for his weeping children. He was working in the commercial figurative tradition of his time, producing images intended to move through print trade distribution and end up on walls in ordinary homes. That a particular cultural weight would settle on the series, that the phrase cursed painting would eventually attach itself to his work and prove remarkably durable, was not a part of the original commission. The weeping children were produced to be sold and displayed. They were sold and displayed in very large numbers, and then something else happened on top of that, and the something else is still happening. The organized burning events of the autumn and winter of 1985 were by almost any measure a notable public response to a newspaper story. Readers who had been carrying crying boy prints in their homes for years, prints bought in Woolworths for a few shillings, prints received as housewarming gifts, prints inherited along with other modest domestic things, brought them to collection points, mailed them to addresses printed in the newspaper, or simply burned them in their own gardens, and reported that they had done so. The photographs from the organized events show stacks of framed prints piled for burning, and the piles are larger than might be expected. Not dozens. In some photographs, the count runs into the hundreds. The people who brought them were not, for the most part, people who had previously described a strong belief in the supernatural. They were people who had read a story and found, on reflection, that they preferred not to have the painting in their house any longer. Folklorist David Clark, who has written carefully about the 1985 events, has described what happened as one of the more complete examples of a tabloid-generated story achieving genuine folkloric status, meaning that the story crossed from media coverage into lived belief in a way that caused people to change their behavior, alter their physical environment, and pass the narrative forward through their own telling of it. The burning events were part of this. They were not simply a readership engaging with a newspaper campaign. They were a community performing a response to a perceived threat, and performance of that kind is one of the ways a story becomes a legend rather than remaining an article. The newspaper coverage was the spark, in the plainest possible sense, but what burned was something older than the headline. The story's movement from those autumn bonfires into the early internet is one of those small cultural migrations that proceeded almost without documentation, though its traces are visible if a person goes looking for them. By the mid to late 1990s, when British internet use was expanding rapidly through domestic dial-up connections and early web browsers, the Crying Boy story had found its way onto paranormal enthusiast websites, Usenet news groups, and the early discussion boards that prefigured the forums of the 2000s. It was well suited to these spaces. It had a named object. It had a specific originating media event with a date and a newspaper. It had a set of reported incidents and a geography: Yorkshire, the Midlands, Birmingham, Glasgow, rural Wales, and it had the appeal of a story that was recent enough to be within living memory, while also being old enough to have acquired a patina of settled legend. The structure of the story traveled well. In an online environment where a narrative must be transmissible enough to be passed from one person to the next in a few sentences without losing its essential shape, the Crying Boy legend had what was needed: object, claim, history, incidents. The person posting it could say, "There is a painting called The Crying Boy," A tabloid reported in 1985 that it always survived fires while everything around it burned. Thousands of people claimed to have had the same experience. The painter's name was Giovanni Bragolin, and the prints were sold in Woolworths. That is a complete story in 5 facts. It carries enough detail to sound researched, and enough strangeness to be worth passing forward. Each person who posted it in a new thread or on a new website added a small deposit of attention to the story's ongoing existence, without meaning to, without effort, simply by finding it interesting enough to share. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, paranormal investigation groups began documenting the crying boy case with more formal attention. Regional branches of organizations interested in the study of anomalous claims treated it as a case file, a defined event with a beginning, a set of associated reports, and an ongoing accumulation of new testimony. New incidents continued to be claimed and recorded well into the 2000s and beyond, and people who had read the original 1985 coverage and kept the story at the back of their minds for 2 decades would report, when asked or when the topic came up, that their cousin had owned the print and that something had happened. Neighbors, aunts, flats in Sheffield or Aberdeen or Cardiff where someone had kept the print against advice and later experienced a fire, an accident, a run of bad luck. The incidents were not substantively different from what had been reported in 1985. They were the same story, held and passed forward by the same mechanism, the story's presence in the mind, making certain subsequent events available for incorporation into it. None of this is evidence that the painting causes fires. The fire investigation science that was applied to the 1985 incidents, the polymer varnish layers, the insulating properties of framed glass, the behavior of falling framed objects in burning rooms, the tendency of flames to move along fuel loads rather than across open floor space, accounts for the reports without difficulty. The prints survived because of what they were made of and how they were positioned, not because of any property the image carried. The incidents that could not be accounted for by these physical mechanisms were, without exception, incidents that could also not be verified. Reports and letters to newspapers, remembered stories passed through several tellings, claims with no associated fire service record or insurance documentation. The verified incidents had physical explanations. The unverifiable ones had only testimony. This is a consistent pattern in anomalous claims of all kinds, and the crying boy case runs exactly true to it. A frame crying boy print from the 1970s, listed on an online marketplace in the early 21st century, often carries something the print sold at Woolworths never did: a description. The seller notes the original frame, the slight foxing at one corner, the dimensions. Sometimes they note that the print has been in the family for decades and has now been cleared from a house. And then, in some listings, enough that it is a recognizable pattern, there is a sentence or two about the curse. The print is described as the famous cursed painting. A summary of the 1985 story is included, sometimes accurate in its broad outlines, sometimes carrying the accumulated variations of 4 decades of oral and online transmission. The asking price on a listing that includes the legend is fairly consistently higher than the asking price on one that does not. The story has become an asset to the object. This is a curious thing. In 1985, the story was a reason to get rid of the print, to burn it in a garden, or deliver it to a newspaper collection point, or at minimum take it down from the wall. By the 2000s and 2010, the same story had become a reason to seek the printout, to pay more for it, to want the version with provenance attached, the original 1970s frame, the correct period of manufacture, the complete accompanying legend. The painting's reputation had traveled through its burning and come out on the other side as something more valuable than it had been before. This is not so different from what happens to other objects whose histories give them weight. A piece of furniture associated with an unlikely past, a ceramic figure from a production run that attracted a legend. The object becomes more itself when the story is attached to it, and the story, however it began, however it traveled, is now part of what the object is. Some sellers include printed summaries of the legend as actual accompanying documentation slipped into the back of the frame or enclosed in an envelope with the lot. The summary runs to a paragraph or two. The Venetian painter, the commercial pseudonym, the Yorkshire firefighters, the Sun headline from September 1985, the mass burning events, the thousands of letters. The print is sold as an object with paperwork, the way significant furniture sometimes comes with a provenance note folded in the back of a drawer. The paperwork here is not a certificate of authenticity from a gallery. It is the story, written down and passed on, a small document of the legend's own continuing life. The weeping child's face in these listings is always the same face, the dark background, the glistening cheeks, the eyes that are not looking directly at the viewer, but are slightly averted, fixed on something the viewer cannot see, with a grief that is completely general, not the grief of a specific child for a specific reason, but something distilled and representational, the idea of a weeping child rather than a particular one. This is partly what made the image so widely reproduced and so easily placed in domestic spaces. It did not insist on a context. The grief was present without any accompanying narrative of cause, and this made it available to whatever feeling a viewer might bring to it. For the decades when the prints were simply a common domestic object, that quality passed without remark. After 1985, the absence of context began to read differently. A child weeping without visible cause, in a dark space with no adult present and no legible reason given for the tears. Read through the frame of the curse story. This detail acquired a quality it had not previously carried. The image did not change, the frame around it changed, and the image, as viewed, changed with it. This is how the objects that carry stories tend to work. The material thing remains fixed, the story moves, and the story's movement alters what the material thing is, functionally and experientially, for the people who encounter it. A person who sees the Crying Boy print for the first time today, having heard the legend beforehand, sees something different from what a person in 1968 saw when they lifted a newly purchased print out of a brown paper bag in a terraced house living room and held it up against the wallpaper. Both encounters are with the same image. One of them includes the story, and one of them does not, and the difference is not small. By the time the print in the regional auction house reaches its bidding, the small crowd has been standing around it for a few minutes. They have looked at it with that particular quiet attention. One or two of them will have remembered exactly where they first heard the legend, a parent's mention, a newspaper read, in a waiting room, a website encountered late one evening. The lot number sticker is unremarkable. The brass carriage clock beside it is also unremarkable. The Crying Boy print is unremarkable in its physical construction and entirely particular in what it carries. The bidding, when it comes, will likely settle higher than the clock. Paranormal investigation groups that have documented the Crying Boy case over the years tend to describe it in terms that are careful about the distinction between the reported events and the explanations available for them. New claimed incidents come in steadily, even in years far removed from the original media coverage. People who grew up knowing the story and who, encountering a fire or a run of misfortune in a home where the print was displayed, feel the narrative offer itself as a frame for what happened. The story is available to them because it was passed on through decades of family conversation, through internet forums, through the particular British cultural memory that holds the crying boy image as a known reference point, the way it holds other pieces of shared cultural furniture. The story circulates because the conditions that make it circulable have not changed. Human memory, pattern recognition, and narrative reframing operate now as they operated in 1985, and as they operated before the newspaper story ever existed. An inkjet press in a commercial print facility produces a reproduction of the crying boy. This is happening somewhere, in small numbers, on an ordinary afternoon. The paper advances through the machine on a feed roller, and the image builds from the top of the sheet downward, line by line, the way all inkjet printing works, a process invisible from the outside, happening in the closed space of the machine, where the print head moves back and forth in passes too fine for the eye to follow. The dark background appears first, the upper field of the image where there is only pigment laid over white paper until it becomes a convincing dark, then the child's hair. Then slowly, the face begins to form. The ink is warm when it exits the machine. There is a faint smell that belongs specifically to new printing, a quality of solvent and pigment that fades quickly as the ink cures. The image, emerging line by line, does not look like anything at first. Then it looks like a child in darkness. Then the eyes appear, slightly averted, fixed on that point outside the frame. Then the cheeks, where the tears catch whatever light the original painting placed in them, rendered now in the four-color process of a modern print, the same glistening effect achieved through different means, different inks, the same optical result. The new print will be sold. It will be framed, or not. It will be listed online with a description that includes some version of the story, or it will be listed simply as the crying boy Bragelin reproduction, a 3, and the buyer will supply their own context. It will go into a house somewhere and hang on a wall, or lean against one, or be stored flat under a bed, while the person who bought it decides where it belongs. Other things will happen in that house, as other things happen in houses, and some of them will be unremarkable, and some will be inconvenient, and some will be worse than that, and none of this will have anything to do with the print on the wall or under the bed. The print will remain what it is, pigment on paper, behind glass or without it, the face of a weeping child in a dark field, patient and unchanged. The weeping child in these images has no name. That detail, small and consistent, is part of what makes the image function the way it functions. A named subject carries a specific story that closes off other interpretations. This child, at this moment, for this reason. An unnamed weeping child opens outward into the general. The grief is given no context, and the absence of context is an invitation that every viewer accepts differently. For several decades, the invitation was accepted as a piece of sentimental domestic imagery, the general feeling of tenderness toward a suffering child, soft and unspecific, the kind of emotion that could be housed comfortably above a sideboard or at the end of a hallway. Then the story changed what the invitation pointed toward. The absence of context became, through the story, something that felt more open-edged. A child weeping for no visible reason, in the dark, for decades, on walls and houses across Britain. Framed this way, the image has a quality that framed the other way. It did not. This is not the fault of the image, and not a property of the image. and not evidence of anything supernatural in the image. It is simply evidence of how images work in combination with stories, and how stories work in combination with images, and how these two systems, the visual and the narrative, reinforce and alter each other in ways that operate partly below the level of conscious analysis. A person does not choose to find the weeping child more unnerving after hearing the legend. The choice, to the extent there is one, was made earlier, in the moment of hearing the legend at all, in the moment of filing it in memory, in the moment of bringing it to bear on the image when the image is next encountered. By then, the framing has already done its work. The auction ends in the mid-morning. The lot numbers reach the crying boy print in their sequence, and the bidding is brief and results in a purchase, and the print is wrapped in paper for its new owner and carried out into the car park and placed carefully in the back seat of a car. The driver sits for a moment before starting the engine. The print is face down on the back seat, which is not any particular choice, only the practical arrangement that made it easiest to slide it in without the frame catching on the door frame. The October light comes in through the windscreen at a low angle. Other people from the auction carry their lots to their own cars. The brass carriage clock, the dinner plates, the two barometers still leaned against each other inside a taped cardboard box. The print will be driven home and taken inside and propped somewhere while the new owner decides. There will be the question of where it belongs, the way all acquired things prompt the question of where they belong, the domestic rearrangement that follows every addition to a space. A nail, a measuring tape, the small ceremony of hanging something for the first time, stepping back to check the level, adjusting by a fraction. The weeping child's face in its original 1970s frame with the slightly hazed original glass will find its place on a wall somewhere. It will hang there as it hung in so many other rooms, with the unremarkable familiarity that all wall-mounted things acquire after the first few weeks, seen daily and no longer consciously noticed, present but not attended to, part of the room's furniture, in the way everything eventually becomes part of the room's furniture. What the print carries will also hang there. The long story of a Venetian painter working under a commercial name, the mass reproduction, and the chain store distribution, and the terraced houses, and the market stalls with their chalk-lettered prices, the firefighters in the autumn of 1985, and the newspaper, and the thousands of letters, and the bonfire photographs, and the legend that crossed into something genuine enough to change how people behaved, the online threads, and the collector listings, and the paranormal documentation, and the new incidents still being reported, still being noted down, still being passed forward through the same mechanism that has always moved stories forward. A person finding a narrative available to their experience and accepting what it offers. The image itself is patient with all of this.